Welcome to Charts Today Energy. My name's David Linton, and today's edition for Tuesday, the 30th of October, comes to you from London. And the energy mix falling further this morning with global sentiment just shrinking. Dollar is still remaining strong, pushing to really test this August high. And of course, if we move above that, that would be bullish. And we are seeing the long-term chart just looking more and more bullish all the time. Still have upside targets here. Anywhere between 2 and 1.25% and 2% higher. So we are seeing higher dollar, lower euro. So euro sinking against the dollar. That August low coming under pressure. So we do have target to 112, and that's very much what we're playing for at the moment. If we activate this downside target on the euro, that's very significant. We've got some quite big long-term downside targets, so euro is still vulnerable to a collapse. Looking at dollar against the yen, looking strong here again this morning, back into bullish territory, and that's normally a lead indicator. We see the dollar bullish against the yen, we see that follow through. Sterling lower against the dollar, below the 128 level this morning, and bearish on all three time frames, and again some very big downside targets for sterling against the dollar. So that dollar strength is really a dominant factor, and if we look at sterling against the euro, we're sinking lower here this morning as well, and against the Swiss franc also seeing sterling lower. Markets were down quite heavily last night. We saw the Nasdaq down 2%. That's putting us into a very bearish mood on stocks. Looking at the DAX this morning, we're down about 0.25% and clearly bearish in all time frames with downside targets. So we are seeing a deterioration really. Gold actually weakening a little bit on that stronger dollar, and US 10-year yields actually recovering a little bit to head back in towards bullish territory. So bond yields recovering, but in Europe, bonds are still looking strong on the short term, so the yields are actually recovering a little bit. Taking a look at the energy mix, we start with Brent crude. Still looking bullish medium and long term, but short term it has been a struggle. And we see this morning we're rising and then we fall away quite sharply. We are susceptible to these falls to the downside. We've got good long term upside targets still in train, but we're now starting to see on the medium term charts downside targets as well. And the interesting thing here is we've got an upside target to 82 and a downside target to 75, and this is on the 60-minute chart. If we fall below 76.50, say, we then activate that downside 75.30. If we go above 78.10, then we activate to 82. So it's a case of waiting for the break. And interestingly, we had this downside target back in October, early October, and was given and met. We're now to wait for these targets to be activated. We do have actually one downside target activated, and it does sort of favor the downside. The micro targets are the 1 minute targets, and here we see that we do have short-term downside pressures more likely than these upside targets. This one activated some 3% lower, 74.70. 73.50 has been hanging over us since last week, and so it is favoring the downside for crude at the moment. And we see the correlation here with the dollar index is negative, as we would expect. Stronger dollar, weaker crude. Looking at WTI, much the same picture. Downside targets. If we make new lows, that would activate a very big downside target, 58.20 on WTI. But we do have downside targets that are really dominating at the moment. Medium term, we've turned bearish on this chart, quite different to Brent. If we look at Brent on the medium term chart, we're actually holding our bull trend. On WTI, we're actually already into bearish territory on that medium term chart. So quite significant there, and we see the fall away is sharper this morning, so we are seeing that again, a stronger dollar just pushing that there. US nat gas sitting at $3.17, but we do have an upside target to 3.27. Looking at the 60-minute chart, we do have quite a few downside targets and one lone upside target that's not activated, so that's quite interesting. But we are just holding around those three teens area. We need to just get back above the 60-minute cloud to be bullish, but generally speaking, in the turmoil that we've seen in recent weeks, US nat gas has held up fairly well. Heating oil looking similar to crude, lots of downside targets here. 2, 9, 4, 5%, all lower, and again just looking a very similar picture to the crude chart, of course. And RBOB also just recovering a little bit today, but has broken down quite significantly there on the chart, so looking bearish. Coal prices actually have been weaker. We saw yesterday there's this bit of a recovery and then a sell-off. This is a common theme where we see this coal sort of has a relief rally in the morning and then sells off in the afternoon, and we're seeing that on API too. Remembering I'm running on Thomson Reuters Icon data here. If you're sitting on Trayport, you'll have more liquidity in your charts, and so you'll have better charts and also maybe slightly different targets. But for the moment, we've got 94.70. That's 0.84% downside. So looking pretty worrying there. And so coal still looking a bit bearish, and API 4 similarly. Long-term targets are good, but the short term is to the downside. Emissions really broke down yesterday. We had quite big falls. There's been a bit of a recovery this morning, up 2%, but we are really now testing levels that we haven't seen since August, and it's looking very toppy. We've seen the recovery this morning. The 1 minute chart's quite useful from emissions, and we see here it's all downward moves. So any move to the upside like this morning tends to be short-lived. So it's quite key that we're seeing that. And of course, the crude price having an effect here. We're positively correlated with crude oil on the 60-minute chart, on the daily chart, sorry, and on the 60-minute chart, we're actually negatively correlated. So we're just bucking the trend at the moment. But generally speaking, we are falling on the crude price. NBP down this morning. Again, this is the ICE contract. Your OTC data might be giving you a slightly different picture, but NBP is down 1.5%. We had a bit of a recovery yesterday, but we fell away towards the end, towards the close. There's just a lot of closing there, and we've fallen quite sharply at the open this morning and recovered some of that, but it's looking pretty bearish. And we're seeing here again, almost like a head and shoulders pattern. It's starting to bear away, so we are seeing NBP lower, 65.10, 62.40. So it is, we are seeing that. And the outlook is still for potentially lower targets. So this target here of 62.40, that's 5% lower. We haven't activated it on the 60-minute chart yet, but if we make new lows on NBP, that will be bearish and will point more and more to that target. TTF, the targets are a little bit clearer. We're falling away quite sharply. Again, we see yesterday we recovered and then fell away. Little bit of a weak recovery this morning. It's not really giving us any upside targets, and we still have these downside targets hanging over us: 23.70, 23.60, 23.75, 23.95. Multiple targets to the downside really does give us some idea that this is quite likely to see further falls in the short term. We're seeing NCG looking pretty bearish, and Italian gas, of course, looking pretty bearish as well. German power is up slightly this morning. It's been a bit of a seesaw yesterday, but we did shrink lower towards the end of the day again. And if we look at the targets on the 1 minute chart, there's lots of them, and it's really just pointing to power prices falling further. So generally that's weaker. We're seeing a little bit that Nordic power is bucking the trend. It's building a little bit of a base and looking stronger. Had sharp falls on the long-term chart. We had these sharp falls in September, but we are recovering a little bit. Again, the 1 minute chart here will give you some idea. We still do have quite a lot of downside targets, so any recovery here could be short-lived. We are just seeing a fairly negative backdrop for power prices. Czech power was down quite substantially yesterday. We're seeing really just this fall away, downside targets here being given and met, and Polish power, which has actually looked relatively strong, actually now starting to fall away as well with a new target, 4% downside. That's it for today. Until tomorrow, happy charting. See you then.